From David's Werner, this is Dialogues, a podcast about artists and the way they think. I'm Helen Molesworth, your host for this season. Every episode features a conversation with artists, curators, writers, designers, philosophers, filmmakers, and musicians about what it means to make things today.
Hey everybody, it's Helen. As you all doubtless know, the current administration has singled out trans people in a particularly cruel and disproportionate manner. And pretty much everyone I know is trying to figure out just exactly what the hell is going on. So today we are offering a double header of two conversations in support of our trans siblings. The first is with Chase Strangio, a civil rights lawyer at the ACLU. Chase was recently the first openly trans lawyer to argue before the Supreme Court in an attempt to overturn North Carolina's ban on gender-affirming health care for trans minors. The second is with artist Laurie Simmons and her friend Maryhope Howland Rutherford, both founding members of the parent activist group Future, Families United for Trans Rights. These conversations are inspiring, and they offer concrete suggestions for what we can all do to help protect trans children and ensure the human rights of trans people. Thanks for listening. Chase, thank you so much for taking time out of what I'm sure is a very busy time in your life to talk to us and more precisely the Dialogues listenership about the things that are going on that affect trans people, but that really affect all of us as citizens of the United States. So the first thing I want to ask you, because you are a lawyer at the ACLU, is as a lawyer, could you please explain for our listeners what is potentially illegal and or unconstitutional about the executive order that begins, quote, defending women from gender ideology?
When we talk about executive orders, it's very important to talk about what is the constitutional power delegated to the president, what is the power delegated to Congress, and what is the power delegated to the courts. Because right now we are in a little bit of an impending constitutional crisis. And one of the things that we're seeing is that the president is claiming a lot more power for himself than the Constitution anticipates. And we as a country have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do about that? Are we going to defend our democracy? Are we going to defend our Constitution? Or are we going to continue to see widespread capitulation to this broadly claimed authority from President Trump? And so when you read an executive order like this one, which he signed on Inauguration Day, I think the title alone should give people pause that this administration is interested in defending women when they have selected leadership that has across the board been responsible for causing harm to women, both individually and as people in power. So hopefully people have given pause before taking this on. And then as a legal matter, so the EO itself is not self-executing, and this is something that's very important. It is a directive by the president to federal agencies and other federal officers to do things. And this particular EO is in essence directing government officials across the federal government to declare that transgender people are not protected under federal law and in fact are going to be targeted by various instruments of government. Now, there's very few things in this executive order that happen instantaneously. So some of those things are unconstitutional and violate federal law for discrete reasons. For example, denying transgender people passports and other identification that aligns with the sex designation that they live as. That violates Equal Protection Clause, the Substantive Due Process Clause, as well as the actions taken by the agency are unauthorized by law in myriad ways. Now, the order itself is contemplating a host of unconstitutional actions from federal officials across government. And in the weeks since those first Inauguration Day executive orders, we've seen how this administration is seeking to override the role of Congress which is to allocate money to different purposes. It is not the role of the president to cut off funding that he disagrees with, but that's what we're seeing. And I think that's the central thing we should recognize as being unconstitutional in all of the actions that have taken place thus far. And when we look at something like this, so-called defending women from gender ideology, EO, this is an attempt by this administration to target unpopular group of people who represent a very, very, very small percentage of the population and use those attacks to broaden the power of the president more broadly. And that, I think, is something that we should all be attuned to as we look at all of the chaos around us.
I think that that's really useful. I just want to amplify one thing you said. So one of the things you're suggesting is trans people are, in fact, an extreme minority. It just numerologically, like you guys are, you're a really small group of people. And the president of the United States is bringing the full weight of its power down to bear on this very small group of people in order to expand the power of the presidency.
Exactly. That's a perfect summary of what I'm saying. And to drive the point home, we are less than 1% of the population. And yet we were the single most significant target of negative campaign advertising by the entire GOP in the lead up to the 2024 election. And we have been the subject of more executive action than our population numbers would suggest would be warranted every single day since the president took office. And your point is exactly right. He is doing it in order to expand his power as president.
So a lawyer once told me that the four most important words in the United States law were due process and equal protection. And you've actually just used those four words in your first answer to my question. And I wonder, as a lawyer, could you tell me if, one, you agree with that statement, and if you do, why are those the four most important words?
I think it's a great reminder of the importance of those words. I don't know that I would say they are the single most important words, because right now I'm thinking about a lot of the more structural framing aspects of the Constitution. But when we think about life in the United States over the last 150 years, it has been framed and defined by the post-Civil War realities that the Reconstruction Amendments afforded us. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments recognized in the wake of the Civil War that we had to do a reckoning, and we had to change our constitutional norms, which had been originally conceived to allow for chattel slavery, an unconscionable structural framework for our government. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, known as the Reconstruction Amendments, start to try to remedy those past harms and implement a notion that individuals should be afforded the particular constitutional protections as individuals by virtue of the fact that they are here in the United States. And the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clauses of the 14th Amendment have been the bedrock principles for, striking down racial segregation in schools, identifying a fundamental right to abortion, ending, attempting to end the de jure discrimination against Black people in the United States. Though obviously they have not been wholly successful in doing so. And so these are central bedrock principles by which we rely on, our ideas as part of the American fabric. And they are under such wholesale assault. It's hard to really overstate how serious this is. I mean, even before President Trump took office, we saw state governors, state legislatures, really flouting these principles. It was part of what teed up the ultimate overturning of Roe v. Wade, which has changed the contours of life in this country. We have seen the attacks on trans people, in essence, call into question whether or not the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution really means what courts have interpreted it to mean for the last 150 years. And now we have a federal executive that's first action in office was to declare that birthright citizenship, a hallmark of the 14th Amendment, is no longer the law. Now, he can't override the Constitution, but he is calling into question every single one of these principles, and we should be gravely concerned about that.
And can you just, for the legal wonks who are listening, but also for all of us, I just want to drill down. What does equal protection mean?
Equal protection means that every individual should be treated equally to others and not simply as a member of a class or as someone who can be the target of government discrimination, either by the states or by the federal government, without the courts overseeing those attacks. So the Equal Protection Clause is a limit on government power, and it affords the individual with a right to equal protection under the law.
And then can you also do the same beautiful breakdown for due process?
And due process is a little more complicated because it has both procedural and then substantive components. So the first procedural aspect is you can't be deprived of life, liberty, or the pursuit of life or liberty or property without, I want to say the pursuit of happiness, but that's not it. Life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So that says that the government can't take from you without process these certain fundamental things like liberty and property. Now, that due process provision in the Constitution has been interpreted by the courts to also have a substantive component. In essence, there are certain fundamental rights that the court has recognized that individuals have. And those fundamental rights include, for example, a fundamental right to privacy, a fundamental right to marriage, a fundamental right to care for your children. And so that too is protected under the Constitution as it's been interpreted by the courts, both against intrusions by the state government and by the federal government. And so that too is a protection for the individual against government intrusions. And the courts, going back to our separation of powers, are there to ensure that governments don't intrude upon these fundamental liberties that we have.
Martin Luther King and Fannie Lou Hamer were both known to say, none of us are free until all of us are free. And that in and of itself, that phrase is a paraphrase of a line by a 19th century Jewish poet named Helen Molesworth, who happens to be the poet who penned the poem that is on the base of the Statue of Liberty. Give us your tired, your weak, your huddled masses. I hope people remember this stuff from elementary school. This is a basic sentiment, a kind of ethical building block of civil rights movements across the country for the last 100 years. This idea that none of us are free until all of us are free. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking about what that means right now from a specifically trans perspective in this moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is such a critical guiding principle. And unfortunately, I actually think that civil rights movements have been drawn away from it repeatedly over history, because what happens when you turn towards the law is you seek inclusion often by distancing yourself from others, which is why we see such piecemeal movements under the law in civil rights, that we are protecting this subset of people and will come back for the next group. And that has not served us. And if you go back to the quote unquote defending women executive order, the premise of that order is a real authoritarian premise that seeks to control a populace, which is to divide and rule, and to say that we will quote unquote protect and defend women by controlling who gets to be within that category of woman and dividing those who are equally or indifferently oppressed under the law. And so at the end of the day, no cis woman, no woman who is not trans, any way I say it, I know people feel upset at that. No person who was assigned female at birth and identifies as a woman is going to be fully free from these government efforts to control our bodies and define our freedoms if she is not also defending the ability of trans women to also be free. Because the people that seek to harm us both have the same goal in mind, which is to build their own power by limiting the contours of who we can be, by controlling our reproductive choices, by limiting our job opportunities, by circumscribing our families in a narrow, heterosexual, Christian, nuclear family. And that is a mechanism of authoritarian control. So none of us are going to be free of that if we continue to fall in line with their efforts to divide us. And that is going to be the question that we each have to ask ourselves over these next 4 years. Are we going to comply in advance with these directives? Are we going to punch down and not work with the people who we are naturally aligned? Or are we going to recognize that these are broad assaults on our democratic norms and our ability to organize collectively? And I think that is ultimately what we have to look inside ourselves and ask, and then respond accordingly.
And what if I were to say to you, I don't know who is naturally aligned with who anymore, but that the principle of being a human being who has rights in this country, that seems to me to be worth coalition building for. Is that still a possibility, do you think?
I do think I still, in all of this horror and all of the things that I've struggled against and all of the death threats and cruelty that I experience every day, I still believe in the fundamental goodness of people and our ability to come together, particularly in times of crisis. And so, right before inauguration, we saw California, where my family lives, being ravaged by fires, and people came together to look out for their fellow neighbors, their fellow human beings. We have good impulses that we can lean into. I think that what is unfortunately happening is we're living in a climate of toxicity and authoritarian fear-based control, where we are scared. People are operating out of fear instead of a grounded sense of connection. And so I am trying every day to keep myself grounded, to connect with my fellow human beings, to be open to learning, which I do every day. And I just hope we can retain our curiosity and our love for our communities, broadly conceived. I mean, I live in New York City. We live close to people who are vastly different from ourselves. And how beautiful is that?
Chase, how can normal people who are in their studios listening to podcasts, trying to get through the day, how can we help? What can we do?
I mean, I think there's so much that can be done. And the first question, to ask everyone, for everyone to ask themselves are, what are your spheres of influence, and what are your communities that you're already a part of? It doesn't have to go bigger than that. It's about working with the people you already are in conversation with, helping people dispel myths about trans people, about immigrants. Don't let this hateful rhetoric seep into the networks that you're a part of. Everyone has a role to play there, and that is a huge part of the work moving forward. And then there are other incredibly important things to do by engaging in our government at the local, state, and federal level. We need to be speaking to our federal representatives in Congress. They are not doing enough all across the board, wherever you live. We need to be vocal. And that means staying engaged, figuring out how you are going to develop a practice of engagement, and pay attention. If you're in New York City, pay attention to the mayoral race. Pay attention to the school board races. That is where a lot of local control changes in terms of what are the day-to-day realities of our lives. You want to see your mayor and your governor be active against this administration, then pay attention to those races when they come about. And then also just think about what it is that drives you in the world, and whether that's sports or art or your job in IT, there is a role that to play in all of that. Help people understand, how to be part of disruption, creation that is outside of this effort to squash our spirit in every way. And I went to see Cabaret this weekend, and I'm just really sitting with it because, there was a beautiful op-ed in the New York Times for the original actor who originated the role of the MC. And, and Cabaret is a stark warning. And when you watch Cabaret, and it starts out with the vibrancy of Berlin and it ends with Berlin under Nazi rule, that you see how much people's complicity and complacency play a role, and how much they come for the arts, and how much they come for our gathering places. And so protect those, fight for those. We all have those places, and we have to fight for them, and we can't be distracted by them, but nor can we ignore the efforts to get rid of them.
I want to thank you personally and professionally for fighting for the spaces that mean so much to me, and for the people fighting for all of us. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you, Chase.
Thank you, Helen. It's great to see you.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Chase Strangio. Here's part 2, my interview with parent activists, artists Laurie Simmons and Maryhope Howland Rutherford. Maryhope and Laurie, I want to thank you both for joining us on Dialogues today to talk about what's going on in our world. Laurie, I want to just get right into it. As the parent of an adult trans child, can you tell me what your reaction was to Donald Trump's inauguration speech when he declared there are only 2 genders, male and female?
Well, first of all, I didn't listen to the speech. We knew what was coming because the Republicans had dedicated over $200 million towards anti-trans ads, propaganda, etc. So it's not like we didn't know that that was going to be a really large part of what was coming with this administration. We're all shocked that it came so hard and fast, especially because it's still unclear what effect that $200 million of anti-trans ads had ultimately on the election. People are all over the place about that.
Right.
So I have lots to say about being the mother of my trans son, but nothing about that day was surprising. The rapidity and speed and viciousness with which things have been unfolding is shocking to all of us, even those of us that felt prepared.
Right. Maryhope, I understand that your child is a teenager in school, and I'm wondering, do you have worries about the immediate or long-term future of what is being taught in the schools, or how your child and other trans children will be treated in school?
So my daughter turns 13 on Thursday, so she is almost a teenager, as she likes to remind us. But, I'm not worried about what is going to happen to her at school today, right? We're fortunate she's in a very supportive school. It happens to be a private school, which inoculates them to some extent from the Trump policies that leverage federal funding. But ultimately, I am terrified about this. I mean, I'm terrified partially because it's already been that way in many, many schools across our country. And so I think it's almost like, is it going to get worse? And I think it will, even in a blue state like Connecticut. So, I mean, what I'm already seeing in the workplace, and I know through some folks is happening in the schools, is kind of a new license to say negative things about trans people or to students, and to kind of quote unquote whistleblow teachers who might be teaching inclusively or using inclusive texts. And people are scared. And I think one thing that we forget sometimes is that in a society where we don't have a strong social safety net, where our health insurance is tied to our jobs, people are scared about losing their jobs. People feel, especially in this economy, they're protective. And so it takes that much more to protest. Protest is a luxury. Standing up for a community can feel like a luxury when you're worried about your access to your health care or your income. And so I think all it can take is one teacher or staff member that feels emboldened to confront a supportive teacher to really have a pernicious, chilling effect. And I think the other thing to remember is that, like, one email from a superintendent is great. That's necessary. But what we really need to make sure our schools stay supportive is a weekly email, and from the principal and from the teachers, like this support that they're going to defy this perspective from the Trump administration needs to be strong, loud, clear, and repeated often in order for this community to feel safe.
Laurie, you have an adult child. Maryhope, you have a almost teenager child. What are your children immediately concerned about?
Well, I called Cyrus, my son, and asked him how he felt. And interestingly, the week that the EOs came out, he was camping at a hot spring with no internet access and no phone access. So we couldn't speak as often as we usually do. And I was kind of grateful because believe it or not, that's not what's going on in terms of the trans political landscape. Is not something that we talk about all the time. But I did get to ask Cyrus how he was feeling about all of this. And the first question I asked him was, do you feel like you're in danger? And he said, no, I don't. I get up every day and live my life as a man. He's 6'1". He passes. All his papers are in order. He's in a PhD program. So he's a student. He's also studying to be a Buddhist chaplain. He has an incredible friends network. He's really doing well and so grateful for his life. He has a supportive family. What he's really upset about is the fact that children and trans women are being targeted. I forgot to mention, he's also a prison abolitionist, and before grad school was working in women's prisons before and during his transition. So the fact that trans women are being targeted both in sports and in terms of moving them out of women's prisons, and the fact that children are being targeted in terms of gender affirming care is what he's really upset about. And his bottom line, and maybe this is because he's, a spiritual guy, he's really worried that this environment is going to erode trans people's sense of self, sense of loving themselves, and really erode their ability to see themselves as part of a community, and more to see themselves as outlaws and victims.
One of the reasons I wanted to talk to both of you is because you're both involved in an activist group called Future, which is an acronym for Families United for Trans Rights. Could you tell us a little bit about this group, what it has done, and what it is trying to do now?
So almost exactly a year ago, we launched Future. And when I say we, it was literally just me and a couple of other parents of trans kids. Others had more of a history of political activism than I did. I was really new to that. And our goal was really just to come together as people who have trans people in our lives that we love and fight like hell for their rights. And our main approach, partially because this is where the experience was of the folks that came together, was to raise money for really qualified transgender candidates for office up and down the ticket across the US. So we thought this is a niche we could fill. We're still not aware of any other group that focuses exclusively on trans or gender diverse candidates. So we partnered with the Victory Fund to identify qualified candidates, and we ended up raising over $300,000, a lot of which was in small dollar donations of $20, things like this, and a couple of big events that Laurie and I partnered on. At the end of the year, we were able to expand to supporting trans-led charities as well. So as part of this, we consulted with political strategists, we consulted with philanthropic strategists, but always our goal was not about a specific dollar amount. It's always been about growing the community. And I think we surprised ourselves just by how many people we were able to get involved, and how I met Laurie. Tell you what it's like to work on a project like this. It's a totally different activist experience because we all just fiercely love our kids and this community.
Laurie, do you want to add anything about Future and what it's trying to do and what it's planning on doing in the future?
I do. I wanted to say that we have Maryhope, and I have a third partner who said I could name check her, and she's Catherine Bishop, who many people knew as Todd Bishop, who oversaw external affairs at MoMA, who transitioned in the last few years and is now Catherine Bishop and is our third friend. And the three of us, anyone who thinks you can't make new friends over 40, 50, 60, or 70, check in with us. We love each other. We are a newly chosen family. We've got each other's backs. And, when people, it's an example of when people come together for common cause of what Maryhope is saying, the kind of feelings that you can express to each other, and the kind of pride we feel, particularly about what we did with Sarah McBride.
Tell us about Sarah McBride.
Well, Sarah McBride is the first seated trans congresswoman. She's an incredible person. Anyone who hears her speak is transformed. Anyone who meets her is inspired. We raised quite a bit of money for her with the help of Agnes Gund. We partnered to raise money for Sarah. Sarah won her election. She's from Delaware. And she's just bringing it. I mean, she's there. We all know the kind of crap that came up with bathrooms and people trying to draw attention to themselves by aiming and spewing hatred towards Sarah.
I'm also extremely proud, and this goes to like one of the things that makes me feel optimistic about some of the candidates you've never heard of. So, a woman named Amy Wichtendahl, state legislature in Iowa. We raised a third of her campaign budget for her. I mean, which was $10,000. I mean, this is where small donations really matter. And she won. And now Iowa has a transgender state legislature. So, and that is going to make it all harder to pass any of these bills at the state level. Or Emma Curtis, who is a very young city council member in Kentucky. She won her seat by only a few hundred votes with our help. And so just knowing that there is representation at every level, it's just harder to discriminate against somebody who's in the room with you.
Right. And 7 out of 10 of our candidates won their races. And the point about electing these trans candidates is that we all know that how important the personal is, that once you know someone, the world has become so comfortable with the idea of gay people. There are sitcoms, there are stories, there are movies. We will move the needle when it comes to trans people. But you have to know a trans person. It's obvious. They have to represent you politically. They have to be in your life in some way.
Right. So currently, one of the effects of the many executive orders is the threat that federal funding will be withheld for healthcare providers that provide gender-affirming care. And this obviously creates a crisis in the trans community. And I wonder if you could just describe succinctly for our listeners, why is it so important not to withhold this care?
60 to 70% of trans and non-binary youth consider ending their lives. And 40% make attempts on their life before they graduate high school. Rates of every kind of self-harm, bullying, depression, anxiety are all significantly higher for children like ours. This care is life-changing and life-saving, full stop. There is such solid data. So the quantitative data is super clear. Like this care, the availability of this care, the presence of a supportive adult, the presence of a supportive community, take those numbers and just drop them, right? It is healing. And the qualitative stories, the stories you'll hear from parents about getting their kid back, seeing the light shine in their eyes, seeing them come back to life, seeing them just feel like themselves. And I think everybody in the world can understand what it's like to not feel like yourself or not feel like you can be yourself, and then to have the moment of when you feel like you. And that is what this is. And it's safe care. I mean, it's been going on for years. It's not experimental. The idea that there are risks that we don't know about, or that it's being handed out willy-nilly, or any of this is just simply not true.
Right.
And there's so much misinformation out there, but this care is given with love, with caution, from a medical community that is informed and lives in this space and really understands why it's crucial.
I think a lot of people want to help but don't know how. I think a lot of folks are afraid of saying the wrong thing, whether it's misgendering folks or betraying their own ignorance, fear, or confusion. Full disclosure, I am still one of these people. And as parents, you've become activists, and I'm really grateful to you for that. Laurie, you know we have a tight-knit community in the art world of artists and art workers who have trans children. What do you guys need and want from people right now? Are there any particular levers or spheres of influence that folks in the art world can engage in? Because that's really our core listenership.
Well, I want people to not be afraid and to not feel hopeless, and to understand that by finding each other, there's strength in that, and there's comfort in that. And once we're comforted and we find strength, we can move on. So I would say, number one, you have to find your people. That's a strategy to avoid despair. And I think we're really good at that in the art world. The other thing that's really boring is we have to contact our representatives and tell them our personal stories. On Future, we'll be posting resources that make all of this stuff easier. But it's really important to be heard. We're only 3 weeks in, and it feels like things are really quiet. But there is so much going on. We have so much support. There's so much activity, and it's not all visible yet. So I think that I really want to stress that it's so important to realize that there is a hopeful side to all of this, not to be in despair.
I want to thank you both so much for ending on a note of hope and ending on a note of like what we can actually do to help.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks so much, Helen, for taking this on.
Dialogues is produced by David Zwerner. If you like this episode, please follow, rate, and review us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It really does help the show. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you join us here next time.